I'd like to welcome our next panel up for a discussion about value creation from data. And I'll invite Seth Joseph, managing partner, getting this right, at Summit Health, to moderate and introduce the rest of the panelists. A word on Q&A. Feel free to save your questions for the microphone or to put them into Slido. We're getting both virtual questions and audience questions there, but always welcome to hear the voices of those in the room on the microphone.
Good afternoon. Looking forward to this conversation. Can everybody? Yeah, I think the mic is on. Really looking forward to this conversation on value creation through data. My name is Seth Joseph, Managing Director of Summit Health. If anybody is interested in where the 2.8 times valuation premium came from, happy to share the report and more data. And I'm going to have each of my panelists introduce themselves because I can't possibly do that justice.
I'm Mickey Tripathi. I'm the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology at the Department of Health and Human Services.
Michael Buczkowski. I'm Global Vice President and Head of Healthcare Industries at SAP.
Hi, I'm Suchi Sarian, the founder and CEO of Bayesian Health. I also hold an endowed professorship at Hopkins between engineering, medicine, and public health.
Good afternoon. When I walked in, I was the Senior Vice President and GM at Aetion. Now I'm the early founder of the aggregated platform solution that was just brought up in the last discussion. So,
well played. We're gonna get to data, but it feels like we need to kind of carve a path to get there. So we're gonna start off with some softballs here. First off, network effects and healthcare. So we've talked about how healthcare is different. I'm going to offer that prior to my current gig, I ran corporate strategy at SureScripts. SureScripts figured a lot of things out and did very well in the world of health information exchange and e-prescribing in particular. Jeff helped us out, but he may not remember early on in those days. He remembers, okay. And yet in just over a decade ago, SureScripts thought, well, we've got these pipes. We can take the pipes we built for e-prescribing and we can build a clinical messaging network to enable doctors to message to each other. And this was right around the time of high tech. Our research, our reading of the literature, Jeff, not to put blame on anybody, our takeaway was, oh my goodness, networks tip really quickly. So we got to get in the game. Well, it's only been a decade later. So in healthcare terms, we had something to learn about the differences between network effects outside of healthcare and inside of healthcare. Christian, would love to put this to you first. Give us one thing that you've learned that's different about network effects and platform businesses in healthcare versus the literature outside.
yeah, that's to narrow it to one is a challenge. Previously, in another role, I had a really interesting job where the CEO of Medtronic came to me. I was at Medtronic, and he said, okay, I want to completely change the way that we drive revenue. I want to go from revenues based on volume to revenues based on value. Go figure it out. And I thought, okay, $30 billion changing the value seems like a pretty small ask. So I spent about 18 months traveling around and talking to healthcare system leaders, CEOs of health systems. And I found a small group of health systems that let me get really embedded into it. And what I found was, for us to move to value, the model that we had to deploy was a platform model, which was how could we match or facilitate the exchange of value between a technology that was appropriate for a cohort and that cohort which needed to consume that technology. But the reason why I think the network effect became so challenging in that model was really twofold. It was, one, you had an array of stakeholders around the ecosystem with misaligned incentives. So that was a real challenge in trying to get the catalyst for this type of work. The other was data was an over-leveraged asset, that everyone thought that their data was more valuable than it actually was. And what they didn't realize that was only in aggregation and we can get a comprehensive patient picture that their data was really meaningful. And so both of those felt like real stunting elements to a network effect in healthcare that I'm not sure is as prevalent in other markets.
Anybody else? Please jump in. We're going to go round robin.
Yeah, I think the question is also how you really want to define the platform. First, when you look at an individual market, the market is, like you said, very fragmented between the different economical systems, between the different cultures. So in Europe, in Germany, where my company is headquartered, it's very different. So it's less of a commercial approach, but even more regulated. It's also a question how you set your boundaries. When you look at the overall healthcare space, you have the providers, you have the payers. You have the public health, you have the pharmaceutical medtech companies, you have the contract manufacturers, contract researchers, you have wholesale distribution, pharmacies, etc., and all create together the value around the patient as an object or the object of care. And the patient, I always struggle a bit when I hear about patient as a consumer, because normally you don't really choose the type of treatment you would like to get. You don't want to get a second one cheaper if you already bought the first one. The normal incentive ways, like we work with consumers, don't really work out. And so it's really complex to look at the bigger picture and see where are the effects, where does a platform make sense, and doesn't really only stop when you talk about integration of systems or a technical platform.
I guess I would add to that, which is, partly building on the fragmentation. And I think healthcare, I would argue that almost every pathology we see, no pun intended, that we see in the US healthcare system goes back to the fragmentation on the supply side and the demand side. That makes it really different than almost any other vertical in the economy. And we have extreme fragmentation. I mean, and we even think of, we think of large organizations like United Healthcare. Well, they're big nationally, but they're small locally in lots of places, like here in Massachusetts, for example. So you've got that issue, which makes it really hard for the market to self-organize in certain ways and to be able to move forward. What that leads to, I think, and the challenge for platform businesses is it makes it really difficult to get economies of scale and economies of scope. And so those start to present challenges as well that I think are really hard to overcome.
I want to build on what Mickey just said. I think one of the very interesting sort of experiences we've had in the last 4 to 5 years, and I work a lot with data and health data and using that at the point of care for improving outcomes, which is ultimately the holy grail, the difficult piece that's we need to unlock. And one of the interesting things we've discovered is basically this local nature means the way we design platforms have to change. And one of the types of intuitions we've been working on is how do you make it so that it is both a platform but as well as adaptive? Like how do you adapt to the local workflows? And the interesting thing is here, AI is often overused. I mean, I've worked in the field for about 20 years, so it's an area like I feel I can take ownership and push the frontier. But one of the things AI is really good at is basically automatically adapting and learning over time, which means it allows us to build new kinds of platforms and new kinds of data platforms that actually can tune at scale, something that we haven't been able to do before. It's also a thing that really hasn't been explored before, but I think has enormous potential here in terms of being able to build solutions that both feel naturally local, yet are scalable and affordable at scale.
One of the things we heard about earlier was the power of platforms. I think Vince and Randy did a really nice job illustrating for us the megatrends and how platforms can play a massive role. And there was an acknowledgement of the small little thing, the cold start problem. What are some tactics each of you have employed in the real world in healthcare that you've seen or you've had some success with? Mickey, I know in your current role, that's probably a different type of question, but you've got a lot of experience building and working with health information exchanges in the past. Would love to put this to you first.
Sure. Yeah, my current role is just create a new regulation. No, that's actually really hard. I'm happy to talk about that when we talk about the federal piece of this. I guess I would point to a couple things. One is thinking about how you can have just an incremental value proposition on top of where the current assets are currently sort of capable and where they're distributed. And what I mean by that is, if you're trying to sort of completely recreate something and say that we're going to do something really new, and every one of those organizations has to go deep into their stack and start redoing things and as we know, there's technology, and then that flows into workflow. And in healthcare, That is, healthcare is probably the most difficult challenge when you think about, sort of the workflow challenge that's associated with the way technology is deployed. I think that makes it really, really difficult to sell to any organization. So thinking about, what's that small incremental value add that I can add onto existing systems and existing workflows in terms of the way they live today, and then start that as the beginning of, sort of a platform that starts to then build trust and other kinds of things. Another thing I would add, sort of think of is knowing your customers in a really deep way. And I know that sounds really trivial, but I think it's just it's more true in healthcare than almost anything else. And that's, a couple of things. One is and I think I might disagree with a little bit of your framing of developing the adaptive platform, which is to say, build the narrowest possible platform you can that delivers that narrow value proposition that someone really gets. Because otherwise, you're just not going to be able to sell it. It's really hard. And that's a part of knowing the customer, and then knowing the purchasing decision and who's making the purchasing decisions. In a healthcare organization like a hospital, for example, my experience, the chief medical officer, the Danny Sands of the world, are really easy to convince on, hey, this idea of the platform that that does everything, but then go to Beth Israel Deaconess Leahy leadership, and it's like, great idea, Danny. We're not doing that. So I think you have to really realize that you're starting to sell your way up, and the people who you're first talking to who are really enthusiastic about it aren't the people who are making the purchasing decisions at the end of the day. So you have to CMO, CTO, CIO, and then you hit the CFO, and everything stops. And then you have to start, sort of regenerating new ideas and really start, sort of refining your message and refining the value proposition. Last thing I would say with my experience is figuring out what's the coalition of the willing that you need to move forward. There's a temptation to say, I don't have enough, or I need everyone, or I need almost everyone, and you don't. You just need enough people who are going to make the thing work and demonstrate enough success that other people will want to come. And then it's on you to demonstrate the success. We're dealing with that right now as we think about the public health data infrastructure. As many of you may know, we have some challenges with our public health system because it's not really a system. And so we're working a lot on this data modernization initiative with the CDC. And one of the challenges is how do you get 64 different public health jurisdictions across the country to agree to move forward on a platform type concept? And the answer is you don't. You don't. You try to figure out who are the ones who are willing to move forward, demonstrate some success there, and then move your way forward. I would just point out as an example, Texas still does not connect to the nationwide electricity grid. And there are going to be some people who just don't. They're just not going to be there. But you can work your way around that and get enough other players to move forward.
Please.
I want to respond to some of the things Mickey pointed out. So in our experience, what we found is you definitely need the problem where you're creating value very concretely and tangibly, because if you don't have that, nobody understands what you're talking about. And a lot of times when we're very focused on platform and technology businesses, we focus on the general without the concrete, and that's often the biggest hurdle. But the other flip side that's happening is that, like we heard in the previous panel, people are exhausted. They're getting pitched all day long. So they really are, unfortunately, looking for big, broad solutions. And so if they can't see a proof point that you're solving one problem, that you don't have the ability to do a second and a third, at least as a way for them to imagine what that looks like, I think it feels, today at least, very hard to get attention. And then the third piece here is you kind of have to nail, like Mickey said, the impossible task of up and down the ladder. Like what the people at the top care about is this big vision. You can do everything, and you're the only person I have to interact with to get everything done. And then as you go further in the weeds, people are looking for very detailed results on everything and I think that's a challenge, and it does feel like a very tricky challenge to solve. And so some of that means lots of capital, lots of time incubating, finding coalition of the willing to build that early ability to have enough people in the room that you can have the patience to build 2, 3, 4. And some of this in our case was licensing out 6, 7, 8 years of technology from academia in a lab, and that allowed us to accelerate.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll touch on something Mickey says. So I work in the space of real-world evidence. And so real-world evidence is the idea of taking real-world data, electronic health records, claims data, patient-recorded outcome measures, and doing really robust analytics to create regulatory-grade evidence. And really across the healthcare landscape, everyone wants real-world evidence. Pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, digital health companies, payers, regulators, they want to see, I was thinking about Will's comments before. I am married to a very bright radiation oncologist, and we have a rule in my house which is called the Michael Scott rule, which is when she comes home, she has to be able to explain things to me like I'm Michael Scott, so I can understand exactly what she's talking about. So I said, explain to me real world evidence and why it's virtuous for you in your clinical practice. And she said, well, think about studying a tiger in the zoo versus studying a tiger in the wild. You're going to learn a lot more things about a tiger in the wild that you might not be able to learn from them in a zoo. And a randomized clinical trial is the zoo, and real world evidence is the wild. And I said, okay, I got it. So then I thought, well, everybody's going to just line up to want real world evidence. And what we found was there was this real clear need amongst all the stakeholders, which wasn't in the development of real world evidence. It was in determining that the data was fit. And Mickey, it goes to your point about finding that sort of one solution that you can solve that might break up the logjam. And our teams went to work on creating frameworks to determine if real world data coming from electronic medical records or health records was fit for purpose. And just the ability to get regulators and medical device companies and pharmaceutical companies aligned on what fit for purpose data meant began to create this, it began to create the machine started moving more quickly. And so for us, I think really thinking about that, where are the log jams and how can you really laser focus on those log jams, I think is a really important learning in platforms.
Yeah, and it's also a question how things develop over time. So we started in the late 90s, like many other companies, also developing clinical information systems on platforms, working together with Cerner. So they actually built their ISMatch solution on an SAP platform. And this was all about integration, that you have integrated the business side and the clinical side, that you also have the opportunities to do patient management, you can do patient administration, you can do the patient accounting, you have everything out of one box and you can run as a provider pretty independently. Then focus is shifting and we are looking at where is the additional value and how to create additional value, how to bring the different parts together. And one thing that we learned particularly in Germany during COVID is we have also a contact tracing app and the data is simply not there. The vaccination data is not there in one single place. And I can feel your pain. We have more than 400 local health authorities. They are completely autonomous. They can decide however they would like to do. And this is great to also foster innovation. So there is not one size fits all that gets implemented, but at some point it just gets fragmented. So at the system also, and this was my point about how you want to frame the scope, needs to decide, and that's probably a public health topic, to create digital backbone on which as a platform on which then innovation can tie upon. Then you have the entire truth, you have access to the different information, you can have your corona-related apps, you have catastrophic warning apps, you have other apps for your personal vaccination register, for your treatment passes, and etc. But you need to have this one single thing, which I, from my economical background, I would call a natural monopoly. If you don't have this single, you always need to create it with each new solution. And this will become super costly. It will hinder startups and smaller companies because they are simply unable to afford it. And to me, that's a prerequisite for really broad adoption.
We had a question that may be slightly different from the one I'm going to ask. I think it was Michael Sands, around why we don't have meaningful interoperability. And so as a reminder, just over 10 years ago or 12 years ago, the HITECH Act began and federal government began doling out $35 billion to get doctors and hospitals to adopt and meaningfully use EHRs. I think we got half of that equation. We haven't really gotten a whole lot of data sharing yet. And I'm going to be maybe mildly provocative to say the EHR is not the answer. So what is the opportunity for platforms to help address data sharing and data liquidity challenges? Suchi, you want to take a first shot?
Sure. Three pieces here. So the first thing is it does seem like there's very, very rapid progress, at least from a technology perspective that we're seeing in the last couple of years, where more and more startups are coming in. They're starting to make APIs available for making this data. There's obviously pressure from the federal government, which is great, for more and more of these systems to be open to sharing data, which is really truly translating, at least on the user end of it. It feels to me like 5 years ago this was extremely hard, but now there are multiple other partners, vendors out there with whom you can partner to be able to connect and meaningfully stitch data. Now, when I say the word meaningfully stitch data, it's still extremely dirty, extremely messy, and not fully reliable. So what you need then is the ability to scrape that and stitch it in a way where we need technologies that allow us to meaningfully clean it up, stitch it in a way that you can actually build high quality info out of it. I think that's where we're probably seeing the most amount of action from my experience, and where, again, I think there's enormous opportunity for bringing the right kind of machine learning tools to be able to learn from messy data sets, as opposed to traditionally the way we've operated, where we need, in the zoo, like clean experiments in a lab versus in the wild learning that machine learning and is very good to adapting at. So I think it feels like we're seeing more of that. Then there's, of course, the third part of it's still very hard. So this is all still, to me, like a 10, 20%, like it can be done with a huge amount of work and a huge amount of red tape everywhere. So the question is, how do we move from it can be done with a huge, you're climbing Everest on a daily basis. How do we go from there to it being easy to do because it's the right thing to do?
Can I offer a little context and level setting?
Please.
So first, the context related to the first point about, we spent all this money on EHRs and we only got half of it. That was a deliberate decision, actually. It wasn't a mistake. If you go back and look at the decision making, then I wasn't there. I wasn't making the decision. But it was a decision at the time to say, you need to start with the EHR adoption first. Remember, we were talking about 2010, where something like 10% of providers had electronic health records, and that includes, my sister-in-law's macro, access database, and my Microsoft Word or WordPerfect, it was back then, with rudimentary macros. Those were all included in that 10%. And arguably the most complex part of our, economy, that's largely a cottage industry in many ways. So I think we just need to, sort of level set where we were and the challenge of saying, first, you got to move all of that to a digital platform, and then think about the interoperability. And the things that we heard when we were implementing electronic health records when I was with the Mass Health Collaborative here in 2004, 2005, and I can tell you firsthand when we were doing that, the physicians were overwhelmed with what was just in their EHR. And if you started throwing at them, oh, we're going to start getting information from other places, it would have completely blown their minds. The other thing I would offer, though, is by way of context, is imagine if we tried to architect interoperability back at that time. We would have the equivalent of AOL CompuServe interoperability, right? That's what we would have. Think about high-tech was passed less than a year after the iPad first came out. That's what we're talking about in terms of the time here. So imagine how stupid it would look now to whatever rudimentary interoperability we created back then. And now we have the opportunity to think about APIs, to think about much more dynamic kind of system that's based on open architectures and different types of approaches. So that's the context. The level setting part I'd like to offer is, what do we mean by meaningful interoperability, and what's the best way to think about that? 2 points of context I would offer. One, care quality, which I know was mentioned, I think, in Vince's presentation or someone's presentation early on, is a nationwide network that connects up a bunch of different EHR systems, like athenahealth, eClinicalWorks, Epic. It's connected to Cerner and Meditech and a bunch of others. They do now 50 million transactions per day, interoperability transactions, provider to provider for treatment purposes. I would just offer as a benchmark SWIFT. Everyone knows what SWIFT is now because of the Ukraine crisis, right? The interbank global system. SWIFT does 40 million transactions a day. So now we could argue about, do physicians like the CCDs? Danny's going to say, those CCDs are garbage, and I understand that. But let's just, remember that we've got to be able to move forward because we don't have interoperability and standardization across providers. It's the providers themselves who are documenting differently. Mayo Clinic says, I document the way I document, and I'm not going to do it the way Mass General does it. I'm Mayo Clinic. And the same thing with Mass General, right? So it's really hard for technology to solve those problems, but I would just offer that as the first level set, that there was a tremendous amount. It's one of the best hidden secrets, I think, of interoperability, that's happening. Now, the limitation of that is it's only provider to provider for treatment purposes. And we can talk a little bit about federal regulations, about what we're planning to do about that with with the network concept of TEFCA that we call to be able to expand that. Second thing I offer as an example is how many of you have a digital vaccine credential on your phone? Probably most of you, right? I have one as well. I got it from Atrius Health, my provider. Atrius Health didn't give me any of my vaccinations. I don't know how many of you that's true, right? They didn't give me any of them. I have 4 of them. Right? I have the first 2, and then I have the 2 boosters. I got those all over the place. Yet I can go onto my chart. I mean, it's just it's a patient portal. It happens to be Epics, but it's a patient portal, and I can download QR code, standards-based Fire API QR code that has all those vaccinations in that. So how did that happen? Well, all those other places, CVS, the Mass Vax site, every other place, when they got my vaccination, they had a certified electronic health record that sent that message to the Massachusetts IAS registry, HL7V2 standard required by ONC, and then that IAS registry pushed that out to my provider, who got it from all those different places, and now offers me that standardized sort of vaccination credential, even though they didn't do any of those things. So I'd offer that's a lot of interoperability, right? That, again, we just take it for granted. None of us really thought about how did that actually get there? And was that the infrastructure that we created? It was absolutely the infrastructure that we created. That's how that happened. So anyway, is it perfect? Is it solving all of our problems? Absolutely not. But there's a lot more happening, I think, than people might appreciate.
And maybe just to add to that, what I think to set up a platform, subsidy and regulation is a great tool in order to get things going. That's absolutely the right thing. In the end, if you want to have it complete, you need to have business cases. What is the business case for changing data? Technically, interoperability is trivial. I mean, HL7 Fire is extendable, so you can get everything in. You need to get the semantics in. But why open your system to somebody else? What's the commercial background? What's the model? And that brings us then to the specific business platforms, the multi-sided market. That is where it will become interesting.
Yeah, just touching on something Mickey said, because I think it's really to quantify the value of that interoperability, I think is unbelievably important, because what we are learning is we need to demonstrate that value to physicians. So because what's coming is the way that the EHRs were set up is it was sort of billing first, research second. And to deliver really meaningful byproducts of this interoperability for physicians, we're going to need much higher quality data, which is going to require a great deal more work from an already overtaxed workforce. So I think things like that, where we can say, look, we're driving toward interoperability because it delivers this. This is virtuous for you and your patients. And we can continue to do things like that, the more robust and higher quality the data we bring into the EHR. But framing that life cycle, to me, is unbelievably important. And I'm not sure that it's as well, maybe that health systems are articulating it as well as they should be, because there is a big ask coming from the health system to the providers, which is we're going to be needed to put more information into the EHR, not less. So,
I am concerned, though, that I think we've made a huge amount of progress, and what I often hear is complaints around the quality of the data and the formatting standards being different, the data being unstructured, people recording things differently. I really think the answer to this, a lot of this, is developing new technology that allows us to learn from messy data, that allows us to make sense of messy data. I think that's where there's real non-incremental benefit. Because getting thousands and thousands of providers to change their practice, document differently, is just too much of an ask. It's like saying, Siri, can you make sure everybody in the world speaks the exact same way? We're just not going to get that. And we were able to learn from really messy data and all sorts of accents, kids and adults, and I think that's totally possible here. But we often go into the room, and what I find, being part of three different provider systems over the course of the last 10 years as I've worked, like they're tired, they're exhausted. Like, I don't know if putting the ask on them of needing to document better, needing to document more is real. I think, to me, the vastly underutilized resource here is the ability to learn, to be able to extract information from these kinds of messy data sets, to do maybe 95% of the job. And then, because other humans are reading it, right? Today, for real world data use, other humans are reading it and they're able to extract a lot of valuable information that we're not otherwise able to extract, right?
Yeah, and we're seeing that from regulators that are saying, look, we need real world evidence to determine how a device is used in the market. And it's not realistic for us to go and ask now prospectively to collect that data, which means we need to apply NLP to notes to understand. And what that means is we need to educate the teams over at CDRH. Like, look, this isn't going to be an RCT. This isn't going to be perfectly clean data. But it's going to be the best we can get out of the current data set using these tools. Let's walk you through why that should give you confidence in making important decisions. So I completely agree, and I think if we can show decisions and actions being taken off of the data in the construct today with new tools leveraged against it, that's going to begin to really drive confidence in clinicians.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to try with the messy data, but when you really look at clinical evidence and you really want to then create your machine learning algorithm to make critical decisions, I'm not sure whether I completely buy into that. Then at least you need to have a different approach for the different types of data. If for example, the machine is constructed a bit different because the data didn't quite fit, that's something that is acceptable. But once the treatment decision is done by messy data, which you will never really get completely ironed out outside of a clinical trial or defined environment, that creates a whole lot of trouble because the data is then moved onwards and nobody knows exactly where it was sourced from, where was the messiness and what's the degree of messiness. So you need to really rely on high quality data, and to get that you will never get it into an electronic patient file, how we call it in Germany, your EHR, because most of the treatment is trivial. You see one blimp here, one blimp there, but you don't do the structured follow-up. So we have, for example, a customer in Germany, they have 30 years of oncology history of all the patients that were ever treated with any type of cancer. How they were treated, what was the outcome, and they have 2 people who do a follow-up twice a year, independent wherever they move to. If they move to Argentina, they call in Argentina. And they have the complete history about that. So when they come up with new theses, or when they do, for example, paper by initial structuring by AI, that's an easy one. They can go back into the history and look whether that hypothesis would hold, and then set up a different type of a clinical trial on that. But this is never the data that you would ever find in any of the electronic health records. So there are limitations what you can do for science with EHRs. You can do great decisions for public health, you can great decisions for payers, you can make great decisions for the larger audience to abstract, for example, for regulators. But if it really comes to pharmaceutical decisions, I'm not sure whether EHRs will be sufficient with the
I want to
content.
make one last comment.
Yeah, we might have a dividing line right here on that idea.
Which is good, right?
Yeah,
That's
sure.
what makes the
I'm just
battle
going to turn
fun.
no.
So I think there's sort of there's the EHR data is useless, crap,
No.
we're screwed. And not what you're saying, but I'm saying there's sort of that point of view, right? Like, the data is dirty, the data is messy, it's fit for billing, we don't have any of the clinical things, what are we gonna do? That's here. And then the perfect, if it had it all, right? And so I think part of it is like where people are on the scale, and my point of view, coming from working on these kinds of messy data, is today, a lot of healthcare discussions are starting from, sort of, we're used to in healthcare being in lab settings, in RCTs. We start from the ideal, and that is our common perspective. And my point is, I actually think from a lot of the work a lot of the work I'm doing at Bayesian, a lot of the work my peers are doing at Hawkins and research, what we see is like there's a lot more, we're a lot closer to here. And the reason it's possible to believe that's true is if you were to put a physician to read the same record, what quality of information would they have deduced from reading the full record versus what quality of information do you deduce, and so I think a lot of times we're thinking about it as, silly automated tools or inadequate automated tools, and we're sort of equating that to if they can't do it, therefore the whole record is useless. But I think what we really need is to imagine if a really smart physician could do it by pulling all the data together, then could we build the automated version of that allows us to pull the same quality of data together and to some extent do all the kinds of confounding and controlling for confounding that is needed?
And it's not an or. Sorry, I was just going to say, it's not an or, it's an and, right? So
Yeah.
we're,
Exactly.
as we think about, with interoperability and, the need to be able to get data, I mean, I think we do have a fundamental problem, which is, at least in the US, that clinical documentation is done within the construct of getting paid
Yeah.
for what it is you're documenting. And that doesn't mean that clinicians aren't trying to document from a pure clinical perspective, but it's always, however subconscious that is, with an eye toward the payment. And that's just a fundamental problem that we have with the way that documentation happens. And so there's always going to be a limit to what you can do there. But setting that aside for a moment and just saying, well, how can we make best use of what's in the electronic health record? I've been in health IT now for 20 years, and NLP has been just around the corner for 20 years. But I think it truly is now, thanks to the efforts of a whole bunch of people. And what we're doing, from just a general industry perspective, boosted along by federal regulation, is we always had this construct of exchange structured data. You need to structure the data, at the source, or have an intermediary, clean up, curate that data, and exchange that structured data. And what we started to see is, a couple things. One is that's really hard to do. To your point, everyone is going to speak the same language. But the other challenge with that is that means that we move forward at the pace of standardization, right? I don't know if any of you have worked with standards development organizations. They operate according to different, sort of principles, let's just say. And industry responsiveness is not one of the things that propels them to move forward. And so what we've done in regulation is, starting on October 6th this year, actually, all providers, all technology vendors, and health information networks are required to make available all electronically accessible information. So not just the structured data, which we define as, we call it the US Core Data for Interoperability. It's basically the minimum data set of the healthcare delivery system. But they're required to make available all electronically accessible information by regulation. That's going to open up, I think, the opportunity for folks like you to be able to say, I can innovate on that stuff now. Part of my problem was I wasn't able to get that unstructured data at scale. Once you're able to start doing that, we have a lot of high hope that a whole innovation industry is going to develop around that and make much better use of that information than we've been able to.
So I'm gonna jump in just for a moment, but you guys did great because we just blew through my next question around the role that platforms can play and why there's a lot of excitement around data platforms because the EHR plays a role. It's not going to be the be-all, end-all. There are opportunities for organizations, technology to sit on top and aggregate different data sets, clean them. And as an aside, very well done. I set up a straw man, and you tore it down with context and data. So well done, Nikki. So here's the next question around excitement around data. So a couple of weeks ago, there was a Washington Post article that came out reporting that a company called Phreesia was providing data and making data available to pharmaceutical companies. Phreesia's primary business is collecting patient consent and filling out forms at the doctor's office. Now, let's be clear. Phreesia is a publicly traded company. They state what they do, and this set off alarm bells because it raised questions around what their real motivations are. More recently in STAT, it came out that a number of health systems and hospitals were sharing data with Facebook. So data in healthcare, there's tremendous opportunity. There are also some pitfalls. What is the role of trust when you consider building a data platform business? Michael, I'll start off with you.
Yeah, so a former CEO of my company once said, trust is the ultimate currency, and there is a lot of truth in that. So if the data cannot be trusted, either that it can be used or that it's real, that it has value, then it's of no use. You can't use it for any of the machine learning training. You can't even use it for testing. That's also something, this will require regulation. Normally, I always say standardization also diminishes innovation for areas where it's the right thing, But absolutely, this is the moment where also the government needs to step in. I see movements in the EU, I see movements in the US. There's also a Data Privacy and Security Act in California, where we really absolutely ensure that the data is treated confidentially, that the data is treated also for only the purposes that the patient actually gave it to. Think of all the results of all these gene tests, thinking about your ancestors. Not only, think of all the iPhone apps or Android apps where you can change your face that you look older, where you can train a face recognition algorithm, where that ends, because also the name is known plus the face, etc. So it needs to be completely clear what the data is used for. And that brings, of course, the challenge of secondary use. It brings the challenge of pseudonymization, of anonymization, and eventually, besides all good regulation, it will also require ethics governance that one, for example, can go back in a clinical trial that works on anonymized data or pseudonymized data to the original patient if there was an anomaly where it really makes sense. And then that's a question of ethics. That's not a question then of laws and regulation. So big, big challenge.
Any other thoughts?
The only thing I would add is that data is only valuable as the decisions it empowers. So trust can't just be in the quality of the custody of the data, but it also has to be in the analytic methods that are used in order to turn that data into evidence. And therefore, those analytic methods and those epidemiological approaches need to be transparent and they need to be traceable. And I think if we want patients and we want physicians and we want payers and we want providers to be willing to accept decisions based on the analysis of data, we not only have to make sure that we're looking at very high quality data, but we also have to make sure that we're applying very high quality analytic methods that are transparent for everyone to understand. They have to be able, much like they would in a clinical trial, they have to have the ability to deconstruct the analysis of that data.
I'm gonna jump in if it's okay.
Sure.
And you're gonna have an opportunity here. It's my last big question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So we're gonna do this in a fun way. You've already started answering. What is the role of the federal government with respect to the issues that we've talked about today? And you've already addressed a number of them, but would love to hear your thoughts on trust in particular. Christian, who then works a lot with federal agencies, would love to hear how that answer is wrong. Michael, you're in Europe, would love to hear a broader-based view of how other governments have gotten it right. And Suchi, you're the academic, so tell us how everybody did great. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, let me start. So what we're doing is, our goal every single day is thinking about how do we create an open architecture ecosystem for health IT. I mean, that's really the goal, is to say we don't want to pre-engineer exactly what it needs to do. We want to open it up and say it ought to be an open architecture. And by that, I mean, sort of two things. One is interoperability ought to be based on open industry standards and modern conventions like APIs. So we have in regulation a requirement that by the end of this year, and I'd like each one of you to listen to this because this is really important, by the end of this year, every certified health IT developer that covers 97% of hospitals across the country and over 80% of ambulatory practices, so physician offices, is required to make available to their customers a FHIR API, a RESTful API based on an open industry standard that ONC points to, a very specific implementation guide. They are required to make that available to their customer, and their customer, meaning their hospital or whoever it is allowed to use that or needs to be enabled to use that in whatever way they want. So if they want to send data to Zeus Health, or if they want to send data to public health, or they just want to make it available for patients, that's up to the provider, but the vendor is not allowed to get in the middle of that. So we're going to have, by the end of this calendar year, that's a requirement. Now it'll take a couple more years for that to happen, right? But we're going to have, sort of an ecosystem of open APIs. So that starts the process of saying that the other part of an open architecture API, or an open architecture ecosystem from my perspective, is moving beyond interoperability to what I think of as interactivity, which I think might have been in Vince's, sort of presentation. It was workflow integration or something. Moving from data integration to workflow integration. Same concept. How do we start to build systems that just rely on interactivity, that aren't just about, well, I'm going to push information to you, you're going to push information to me, but I'm living in my own world here and my system is built that way. So we're requiring that EHRs basically start to adopt platform-like capabilities, and we're requiring that in regulation. So I think that's the role that the federal government can play, is to not try to over-engineer, but try to say we need to raise that floor and then allow the market to keep going, and then incrementally keep raising it, and then allow, get to the activation point over that cold start point to then be able to say the market can now take this on and innovate in the way the market's going to innovate.
So I don't want to say that's wrong. So I really like that answer.
I disagree.
So I disagree.
Closed architectures.
So just two observations that I would make about where I think the role of government. One is organizations increasing their fluency and competency within the federal government around platforms.
Yep.
Because if they can be thinking about the role that platforms can have, there was a discussion earlier that it sort of framed network effect and federal mandate as binary, and I don't think that they are. I think federal mandate can be a catalyst for network effect.
Right.
And so we're seeing that now in the adoption of real-world evidence by the Center for Devices and Radiological Health and others. So that would be one sort of, if I could make an ask, it would be continued to promote platform thinking so that they understand how they can accelerate it. The other is continue to encourage public-private partnerships, because so much is accomplished by getting all of these great minds together in a collaborative community to solve these problems versus doing it in a very sort of siloed approach. And I have been overwhelmed with how well and how embracing many of the federal groups that we deal with are to public-private partnerships, because they understand the speed in which technology is advancing, and they realize that they need to make sure that they're getting voices from all corners. So.
Yeah, in the EU, we have a very different legal system already, and when we do regulations, we do it right, so we are coming from above. But we have many good approaches to really look very deeply into the topic of data and on AI. We have, for example, an Health Act. We are looking into the autonomous cloud data spaces. We are looking at, for example, particularly important explainable AI. So not only in the health space, but also for creditworthiness, that you get an idea why you have a certain score, and not just that this relates to your neighbor who you live in the same street and who didn't pay his credit back. That's an important one. So we will see many also challenging topics from there, but that is something that also in the end the market needs to play out to see what is possible. Public-private partnerships, I completely agree. That's a great thing. EU is putting lots of money into public grants, where also you have it multinational within the EU. You also have it between universities, between private companies, in order to drive forward the topics of AI, of healthcare, and other ones of importance. Automotive is one, and other industries as well. So.
Since I get the pleasure to wrap this section, I did want to invite everybody to please give a round of applause to the federal government, to ONC, to Mickey, the amount of effort and progress they've made in the last, the announcements he's making are freaking amazing. In healthcare, I feel like you go to a health system, something really, or a health plan, it takes typically 24 months to just even try to get a legal contract through. To be able to get this level of change within the short period of time is pretty amazing. So can we please just start there, please? Thank you. The second thing is this notion of public-private partnerships. I think that is so essential. One thing that's really interesting is some of the best, newest ideas, especially around data, and this area is happening around groups that are experts that are now turning into startups. They're funded, they're making progress, and figuring out ways to enable these partnerships tighter because today, historically, partnerships with the government have not been very easy for small groups. It's much easier for very well-established, bigger groups. So how do you make that happen? And if you could make that happen, I think we'll accelerate. They're more agile, more flexible, often have deeper expertise, deeper pockets, and not pockets, but deeper expertise, and you can see a lot of progress. So I think that's something that would be very, very exciting to see. And I don't wish for a top-down government, so I can't say anything about that. But it is very cool that, our system does make it harder to make progress.
We are running short on time. We do have a number of questions. So one of the more fascinating ones, and I thought, John Moore, you asked an excellent one about how to ensure the proper data governance occurs and privacy of PHI is preserved, especially in light of Roe v. Wade. Hopefully we spoke about the role of trust and governance a bit here. Really interesting question around, quick lightning round, the role of the consumer and the ability for the consumer to participate in data platforms, and perhaps even commercially. Any thoughts here?
Yeah, it's essential. That is where I agree with the notion of consumerism, bringing your own data. You will see more and more that the patients will bring their own data from their fitness trackers, from other devices, all these smart devices. This is something that the doctor needs to be taken into account, and that is exactly like watching the tiger in the wild. Then you have, for example, the heart rate during the entire day and not stressed via a couple of hours or a few minutes inside the hospital. So that's absolutely essential.
Yeah, I would add just one element, which is I think patient-recorded outcomes are going to become a critical element in data analysis. They are, we look for them oftentimes in clinical research questions. They can be there or not. I think the more comprehensively we can get some of those outcome measures, the better.
I guess I would, maybe I'll be a little bit less enthusiastic, is to say I hope that that's true. I think it's too soon to tell. I think we don't know how much consumers want to participate as consumers in that way. And we have big data privacy issues in the US as well. And we just need to remain cognizant of the fact that that could be a damper on consumers' enthusiasm for having any of this kind of stuff, apps and everything else that, that we're pushing. So, I heard in the previous panel someone had said something like, we're in the second inning of 9 innings. I guess when I heard that, I thought, why do you assume we're playing baseball anymore? And that's the thing that we need to recognize is that we're moving from a world that, even though it's got this electronic overlay now, it's still based on the assumptions of paper, bricks, and mortar, right? And that's where we're still dealing with this goofiness around, telehealth and prior auth and some of the stuff that I heard Jonathan talking about at the end of his talk about, why do we have this, claims, in the way that we do right now? But moving to a world where we say, well, if it's natively digital, aren't we going to rethink the way all of this, sort of occurs? And it doesn't happen overnight. It's really complicated, and we're going to live with that legacy for a while. There's a path dependence there, but I think that we need to be, sort of cognizant of the fact that that's going to happen, but in ways probably that none of us can really anticipate.
Well, we are over time. I know we've got a break coming up. I hope this was as fun for everybody out there as it was for me up here. Thanks, everybody.